I'm Drew Stevenson, and this is a lecture about administrative law and regulatory agencies. As a way of introduction, we're going to be talking about the virtues and vices of delegation. In other words, why should we even have a federal bureaucracy or administrative agencies? There are pros and cons to having these. And remember, we're calling it delegation because these agencies exist by an act of Congress, typically. Congress decides to create an agency and then sort of give it the keys of the kingdom, so to speak, entrusting it with various powers and responsibilities, and also setting some limitations or restrictions on it. Now, for my students, the kind of pros and cons I'm about to talk about run through all the cases in our casebook. And so when the courts are, or a majority or dissent is siding with an agency, they're going to go through a lot of the pros or virtues of having agency regulation. And when they're ruling against an agency, they're going to bring up a lot of the same talking points that I'm going to cover in this video. So let's look at our slides. So the first two arguments that we usually hear people bring up in this regard are expertise and specialization. And the idea is that we could have Congress make all the laws, but we now live in a modern, very complex society, and we don't expect every member of Congress to have this type of scientific expertise, let's say, to make decisions about the best policy for vaccine manufacturing or handling epidemics. Nor do we expect everybody in Congress to be able to understand complex climate change models or to understand the intricacies of financial markets and futures markets and commodities markets and so forth, all of these things that need some government oversight and regulation. And so, if anything, we think that politicians are mostly good at winning elections. That's why they're in office. And so the idea is that we could have an agency of people who are really knowledgeable, really experts, maybe leading experts in this field, whether it's economics and financial forecasting or epidemiology and virology or housing markets. Whatever it is that we need to regulate, we have some people who really know that area. They know the ins and outs. They know the big players in the industry and so forth. And the idea is that if someone has that knowledge and expertise, they're more likely to come up with the best answer, the best legal rules for our system to sort of optimize things. Specialization sounds similar and it overlaps, but it's a little different. And of course, people who have a lot of expertise like to specialize in the things that they know a lot about. And if you specialize, you're likely to become somewhat of an expert in your area of specialization. But in terms of administrative agency law, these are a little different. So expertise has to do with knowledge and the likelihood that you're going to come up with the correct answer or know what you're talking about. And specialization means that you're able to really focus on just one task or one area. Remember, the common law judges had to be generalists to judges. So one case, they were deciding a property dispute. The next day, the case, they might be sentencing a criminal defendant, and the next case they were deciding a personal injury tort claim, and on and on and on. But maybe we need someone who really understands, for example, water pollution, and they can just focus on that. They have the expertise, and if they only focus on that, they're likely to become efficient, right? They don't have a learning curve every time they tackle a problem. They get used to dealing with the other experts or the people in the regulated industry, and they can save a lot of steps after a while that they realize are unnecessary. So the idea of specialization and focus is that people who specialize actually become much more efficient at what they're doing, typically. There's also the idea of multiplication of effort. So it was one thing to have in the founding era of the country to have a Congress that could make laws about everything, because we lived in a rather simple society. It was an agricultural society. The entire economy was built on the idea of small farms and artisan craftsmen and things like that. And now we live in a very complicated world where we have to have laws about cell phone providers and hospital machinery and infrastructure, the trucking industry, and herbal supplements that you buy at the nutrition store, on and on. And there's really too much for one Congress to do in a modern, complex society. And so the idea was that we need to delegate some of the rulemaking, because rulemaking is a long process of researching things and going through drafts and meeting with officials, the interested parties, and so forth. And we could get more law and more good law if we multiply the hands. The many hands make light work idea. Also, there's an argument that sometimes we want things like, for example, public health to be decided by people who are nonpartisan or an agency that's apolitical. We all know that you can end up with political brinksmanship in Congress and the White House. I'm recording this video at a time and an end of a congressional term where one party controlled the House and another party controlled the Senate. And unsurprisingly, not a lot of laws were getting passed during this time because each side could thwart the other, or each side would try to gain points against the other. And so maybe when we need something that's high stakes, like public health regulations and public safety regulations or national security regulations, it would be helpful to have someone who is under the radar and doesn't have to make their decisions based on getting reelected in the next election or campaign season. They don't have to spend their time, part of their time in office on the campaign trail and so forth. They can really just focus on doing what's in the public interest. Now, there are downsides to this, right? Experts can become elitists and who think they know everything and become out of touch with the things that really matter, or the lives of the rest of the people in society, because they have such knowledge about one thing. And so we worry sometimes about, we call this technocracy, government by the experts or the scientists, that there's a lot that goes into governance that's about deeper values in our society and norms and morals, and not just coming up with the right calculation or knowing which book to look something up in. And so sometimes we're worried that experts will have an imbalanced view in this sense, or will not question themselves enough because they know that they're the expert. Specialization can have a problem because specialists can get tunnel vision, right? So imagine that your entire job is to regulate the mushroom growers in the United States, right? So you do that on Monday and on Tuesday and on Wednesday and on Thursday and on Friday, and next week you're going to come in on Monday. You are again trying to optimize the regulation and oversight of the farmers in the United States who specifically grow mushrooms. And so it's easy to get tunnel vision and have this become so important that it seems like the only thing that matters, and you're not balancing it against all of the other considerations in our society, or you lose sight of the big picture. Obviously, if we're going to multiply the ability to make laws, there's a risk that we're going to have too many regulations. And this is a perennial complaint, especially from American businesses, that the burden of regulations is too hard to comply with, and it squelches business, it cuts into profits, it hurts, and therefore we don't have as many jobs and so forth. And so if you have too many regulations, it can be a bad thing. All regulations bring some implementation costs. And not only that, there's also costs of monitoring compliance and bringing enforcement actions against violators. And so there's no free regulation. And if you have too many, it can end up having a chilling effect on development, or can end up having a chilling effect on the economy. The flip side of having nonpartisan and apolitical people make our decisions as officials is that they lack political accountability. So if you've ever had a frustrating experience going to your local DMV office to get your driver's license renewed or replaced when you lost it, you know the frustration that you can't really vote these people out in the next election. They're going to be there election to election to election. And so sometimes we have government officials who we're worried lack the accountability that democracy was supposed to provide. Now, let's talk about the world, hypothetical world without any government agencies or regulation, and then the world that we live in, which has a lot, but some would say not enough. So, in the world with no regulation, you get market failure. So, even let's talk about the libertarian utopia of a completely free market, right? That's in a state of nature. So, everyone can engage in commerce however they want, and there's nobody telling anyone what to do. Well, the part of the natural cycle of economies is to have crashes, right? And booms and crashes, booms and crashes. And those crashes, those market failures can have devastating effects. People die during Great Depressions from starvation and homelessness and things like that. And so remember, how part of how we got here is we were in a Great Depression where a record number of Americans were unemployed, people were losing their homes, people couldn't feed their families, and they wanted a government that was going to help and was going to intervene. And so now, in hindsight, now that we're generations away from that, maybe we can say that was a big mistake and they should have let the free market take care of itself, because it will always rebound eventually and markets correct themselves. And maybe you get a bubble in one industry with prices and then that bubble will correct. But in the short term, this can be very painful for people. And sometimes societies never come back, right? Where history is littered with examples of prosperous societies that collapsed. And so you can get a collapse of a society, and that is a risk of having no regulation at all. Also, there's public safety concerns, right? So if you think about a world with no regulation, there's no one who can make sure that the drinking water supply is safe and that's not being contaminated with typhoid or cholera or poisonous chemicals or something like that. And there's no one to quarantine someone who gets the bubonic plague or Ebola. And maybe there's no one to say that if you're going to sell painkillers, that they don't kill the people who take them. So all of these things about public health, people like to be able to go through their lives with a certain amount of trust that the pills that they buy over the counter at the pharmacy probably aren't going to kill them if they follow the instructions. And when they get in their car and drive, it's not going to explode for no reason and things like that. So people like public health, and people like being able to turn on the tap and drink the water that comes out and not worry that last night someone contaminated the water supply. Also, keep in mind that regulatory agencies can really help when you have a situation of political gridlock. And so our framers set up a system intentionally with checks and balances to keep any one party or branch of government from becoming too powerful and overbearing, and also to prevent special interest groups from hijacking the whole system. But sometimes checks and balances can work a little too well, and you can end up with not incremental improvement, but no improvement at all, because everyone is keeping each other completely in check. And as I said, if you have different parties controlling the different houses of a legislature, it's very hard to get anything passed. If you have the opposite party from the president controlling the Senate, it's hard to get people confirmed for judicial vacancies or other agency vacancies. And so sometimes we have political gridlock, and that we have issues in our country of public health or immigration and things like that, where the population has wanted um, broad scale reform for generations, but the partisan brinksmanship prevents this from happening. Also, this is not talked about as much, but in the world before we had administrative agencies and administrative law, a lot of government officials were appointed through what we call simony and nepotism. So simony is buying a political office, basically bribing the person in charge to make you the minister of such and such, or the commissioner of something. And nepotism is handing out government offices and official positions to your friends and family members, right? To make put your son in charge of something, your grown son or your grown son-in-law in charge of, let's say, managing a pandemic response team. And so in the common law era, before we really had the regulatory state, this was an everyday occurrence. A lot of government positions were just given out on the basis of favoritism or because people bribed the person in charge. And then the person who bribed their way into office is also going to be open to getting bribes themselves. And so the modern regulatory state does have a tendency to suppress the corruption and the favoritism in government. Now, obviously, there's downsides, right? There's a big cost of compliance for American businesses. And there's a reason that companies may want to locate their manufacturing overseas or places where they're going to hire a lot of workers or produce things and so forth. So the cost of compliance is a real cost that that gets diffused and spread out through society, but can have a chilling effect on the economy. Here's a term that students should learn: agency capture. Agency capture is where you set up an agency to regulate a particular industry. I'll pick a well-known one like the airline industry, where you have a few kind of major carriers, and we have an agency or an administration that's going to regulate them. Well, who knows more about the airline industry than one of the CEOs of one of the airlines? So what happens is sometimes the agency ends up being directed by someone who from the regulated companies, who turns around and issues favorable decisions either for the industry as a whole or for his company and his company's sort of allies in the marketplace. And so we call this agency capture. And this is a recurring problem in administrative law, where the more a specialized agency that regulates one industry, the agency itself ends up getting captured by the people that they're supposed to be regulating, who then basically regulate themselves in a friendly way. All right. There's always been complaints about inefficient government workers, right? You hear people talk about the bloated government bureaucracy and the inefficient or lazy bureaucrats and things like that. And this is a stereotype that I think is a misnomer and a pejorative way of talking about our civil servants. But there are valid concerns in theory that lacking market discipline, if you have the private sector, if you're an unproductive worker, or you don't get your work done, or you don't show up half the time, you're going to get fired. And because you're costing the company money. And we don't have that same type of profit discipline in the government agencies. There's also a concern with just having more government intrusion. And this is sort of I should have put right across from market failures or public health, that at some point, when does the government stop? So we want the government to keep us safe from contaminated water or from fire hazards and cars that blow up when you turn on the ignition and things like that. But at some point, it's hard to draw a line, and then you have the government essentially regulating every area of your life. There's a famous 20th century author, C.S. Lewis. He's famous for the Chronicles of Narnia, who complained about that in the modern regulatory state, he can't cut down his own tree in his own front yard with his own axe, right, without getting a permit from a municipal office. And so that's the sort of mentality of maybe the government is intruding too much in every area of our lives. Okay, that concludes this little lecture about the basic virtues and vices of delegation. Again, it will be helpful if you have these sort of checklists of the pros and cons in your mind as we go through the cases, because you're going to see these are the talking points in most of the cases that we're going to read from the majority, concurring, and dissenting opinions.